So, imagine for a second being thrown into a pitch black well by your own brothers.
I mean, that is it's a brutal way to start a story.
Right. You are a child, you're left to starve in the wilderness, and you're just listening to the footsteps of your own flesh and blood fading away into the desert.
Yeah, abandoning you.
Exactly. But then, fast forward a few decades, you're no longer this discarded kid. You're actually the architect of an empire.
Wow.
And you are holding the survival of those exact same brothers, and honestly, their entire civilization right in the palm of your hand.
It's the ultimate setup, really.
It is. But today, we aren't talking about, a fairy tale. We aren't looking at magic wands or some divine cheat codes that just magically snap reality into play.
Right. No waving a wand to fix things.
Exactly. Welcome to today's deep dive, where we are diving into the cold, hard physics of human revenge, emotional intelligence, and social architecture.
And it really is the ultimate culmination of this massive political and psychological thriller.
Oh, absolutely.
Because our source material today offers a radically empirical sociopolitical lens on these final chapters of the Yusuf narrative, verses 94 through 101.
Yeah, the blueprint realized.
Exactly. For centuries, this specific sequence, his family finally coming to Egypt, the big reunion, the supposed miracles, it's been coated in this thick layer of mystical fairy dust.
Like a Sunday school story.
Right. But when you strip that away, what you actually find is a blueprint.
A literal empirical blueprint.
Yes, a masterclass in how a single intellect, armed with the law of cause and effect, the law of requital, can engineer an entire society back from the brink of total collapse.
So let's set the stage for you, the listener, right? We are looking at the final moves on the chessboard here.
The endgame.
The endgame, yeah. The devastating famine that threatened the whole region has been managed. Yusuf has completely outplanned the disaster. He's effectively the ruler of Egypt now.
And his brothers, the ones who betrayed him, they came looking for food, right?
Yeah, they were exposed, they confessed, and crucially, Yusuf let them go.
Which is wild.
It is. So now there's this caravan leaving Egypt, heading back across this harsh terrain to Canaan. And that's where their elderly father, Jacob, is waiting.
Right.
And this caravan, it's carrying the ultimate proof of Yusuf's survival and his state authority. It's carrying his official royal shirt.
Which brings us to a moment that has sparked debate for literally generations.
Oh, yeah, the scent.
Yes. Because as this caravan departs Egypt, Jacob, who is hundreds of miles away in Canaan, suddenly just announces to his household that he feels the scent of Yusuf.
And his family's reaction is just brutal.
It's so dismissive. They essentially tell him, you're a senile old man.
Yeah, like your grief has finally shattered your mind.
Exactly. I think he's lost his grip on reality.
But I want to look really closely at the mechanics of this, because the traditional interpretation, it usually defaults to supernatural intervention.
Right, the magic wind theory.
Yeah, the idea that God sent this magical wind that literally picked up the physical olfactory molecules of Yusuf's sweat.
Right, carried it across the desert.
Yeah, carried it hundreds of miles straight to Jacob's nose.
Yeah.
But our sources highlight this massive linguistic nuance here that just changes everything.
It really does, because the Arabic word used in the text is re.
Re.
Yeah. And if we look at how re is used in other contexts within that same textual universe, specifically Surah Anfal, verse 46, it doesn't just mean a physical smell.
Wait, really? What does it translate to?
It translates to power, momentum, dominion, state authority.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's the prevailing wind of a political movement.
So that totally alters the physics of the entire narrative.
Completely. Jacob wasn't, some wizard sniffing a piece of cotton from across a continent.
Right, he wasn't a bloodhound.
No. We have to look at the socio-economic reality of the ancient world. The caravan routes, they were essentially the internet of antiquity.
I love that analogy, the ancient internet.
It's true. You had merchants, nomads, diplomats just constantly moving between Egypt and Canaan.
Exchanging data.
Exactly. And what do you think would be dominating the global news cycle of that era?
I mean, obviously, the famine, right? And how Egypt is surviving.
Exactly. A massive region-wide famine that was somehow being perfectly managed by this brilliant new ruler in Egypt.
So the buzz around the campfires wouldn't be about mundane trade. It would be about this incorruptible, highly moral administrator who was defying the odds.
Right. They'd be sharing stories of his equitable economic policies.
His refusal to hoard grain for the elites.
Exactly. His distinct brand of justice. And Jacob, remember, is a former leader himself.
Oh, that's a great point. He's not just a grieving dad, he's a statesman.
Yes. He is sitting in Canaan, and he is gathering this geopolitical data. He is actively analyzing these reports.
So he's listening to the specific, signature of this new Egyptian leadership.
Precisely. Because Jacob had raised Yusuf, he trained his intellect.
Right.
So when Jacob hears these descriptions of the ruler's moral fortitude, his systemic approach to the famine, he recognizes the pattern.
He senses the rye.
Yes. The political and moral momentum of the son he molded.
It really makes me think of, an art authenticator.
Oh, how so?
Well, when an expert looks at a newly discovered painting, they don't need a giant signature at the bottom to know it's a Rembrandt, right?
Oh, I see where you're going.
Yeah, they just look at the physical mechanics of the brushstrokes, the specific layering of the pigment, the subtle manipulation of light.
Right, the technique.
Yeah, they can deduce the creator from the work itself. They don't have magical vision. They just have hyper-tuned pattern recognition.
That is a perfect analogy.
Mhm.
Jacob recognized the socioeconomic brushstrokes of his own son on the canvas of Egyptian policy.
But the tragedy is that his family completely lacks that level of analytical depth.
Oh, they are entirely surface level.
Yeah, they just operate on assumptions. They know Yusuf was thrown in a well. They assume he is dead, so they view Jacob's data-driven deduction as, the ramblings of a broken mind.
They cannot read the circumstantial evidence at all.
But then the caravan actually arrives. The sons return to Canaan, and they present this official royal shirt to Jacob.
The physical proof.
Exactly. They cast it over his face, and the text says his sight returns. Now, I have to push back hard on this on behalf of the listener.
Okay, go for it.
Because our source completely rejects the idea of a magical healing shirt that physically cures literal blindness.
Right. Completely rejects it.
But by reducing the physical blindness to a metaphor for grief, aren't we just, sanitizing the text for a modern secular audience?
I get you.
Are we stripping away the divine element simply to make it palatable to skeptics?
I definitely see where that skepticism comes from. But the source would argue that insisting on a magical shirt actually diminishes the profound psychological reality of the text.
How so?
Well, it reduces a complex human experience to a cheap parlor trick. The blindness described here isn't necessarily a medical cataract that needs surgical removal.
Okay. So what is it?
We are talking about severe psychosomatic trauma, decades of suffocating, agonizing grief. Even in our modern clinical vernacular, we describe severe depression as a darkness, don't we?
Oh, yeah, a heavy cloud.
Exactly. People who suffer catastrophic loss often report that the world literally loses its color. Their cognitive field narrows. They are, in a very real psychological sense, blinded by grief.
Wow. Okay, so holding the shirt isn't a medical intervention. It's a cognitive shock to the system.
Yes. Think about what that shirt represents in that moment. It is the emblem of state authority.
Right.
It is empirical, undeniable proof that his son didn't just survive the wilderness, but triumphed over it.
He maintained the moral framework Jacob taught him.
Yes, and used it to rise to the highest echelons of power. So when Jacob holds that tangible evidence, the cognitive dissonance of his decades-long mourning just shatters.
The darkness lifts.
Exactly. His eyes are open to the bright reality of his son's survival. The psychosomatic weight vanishes in an instant.
Okay, if we accept that mechanism, that this is about circumstantial evidence, high-level pattern recognition, and psychological breakthroughs rather than, magic, it forces us into a much deeper philosophical debate.
Oh, absolutely. And the source dives right into it.
Yeah, by contrasting two concepts, wahi, which is divine revelation, and farasat, which is human intuition and intellect.
And this is really the crux of the author's argument against the whole magic wand interpretation of prophetic history.
Right, because the traditional view treats prophets like they have a direct radio link to the Almighty, right?
Exactly. Like they're just getting step-by-step instructions for every moment of their lives.
Like a GPS.
Right. But if Jacob possessed that kind of direct, localized revelation, if God could just whisper into his ear, why did he endure decades of agonizing psychological blindness?
That's the huge question. Why didn't the divine just assure him that Yusuf was safe in Egypt?
Exactly. It completely breaks the logic of the narrative.
Because if you have the ultimate cheat code to the universe, you don't spend 20 years crying over a bloody shirt.
No, you would just track him down.
You just go get him. So what is the source's conclusion here?
The conclusion is that even prophets must rely on human intellect, deduction, and circumstantial evidence for worldly matters.
So wahi isn't a cheat code.
No, Divine revelation wahi is not a micromanagement tool. It establishes the absolute, unchangeable, overarching laws of the universe.
The framework.
Right. It dictates the moral and structural physics of reality. But it does not bypass the human requirement to observe, analyze, and act.
So you're given the laws of aerodynamics, but you still have to use your Farasat, your human intuition and intellect, to actually build and fly the airplane.
That is a phenomenal way to put it.
And I love that the author brings in Friedrich Nietzsche here to explain the mechanics of Farasat.
Oh, the Nietzsche analogy is brilliant.
Because it is incredibly unexpected, right? To find a 19th century secular German philosopher smack in the middle of a textual analysis of ancient scripture.
It really is, but the analogy is stunning.
Because Nietzsche wrote extensively about his experience composing Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Right. And he described entering a state where the ideas felt so profound and they arrived with such velocity that he genuinely felt like a mere vessel taking dictation from an outside force.
Like he wasn't even writing it himself.
Yeah. He called it a muse. It felt entirely external to him.
And psychologists today would just call that a flow state, right? Or the hyper-processing of the subconscious mind.
Exactly.
Because when an artist or a philosopher or a leader immerses themselves completely in a subject, when they align their intellect with thousands of hours of observation and thought, their pattern recognition becomes so sharp that the resulting insights feel miraculous.
They feel divine.
They feel divine. And the source argues that this hyper-refined human intuition is exactly what Jacob was experiencing.
Oh.
He had internalized the laws of human behavior and socioeconomics to such an extreme degree that his deduction about Yusuf felt like an absolute certainty.
But, and this is key, the author is meticulous in separating that flow state from wahi.
Yes. Very important distinction. Because human intuition, no matter how incredibly refined, is still fundamentally human. It can be flawed. It is subject to misinterpretation.
Right, it's not absolute.
Right. Wahi, by contrast, represents the objective, immutable laws of nature and society. So Jacob was utilizing his elite human intellect, his Farasat, to read the socio-political momentum.
He wasn't waiting for a divine text message.
Exactly. And applying this to the listener's reality completely reframes how we should interact with the world.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because we are so conditioned to wait for the magical shirt.
We really are. When you face systemic issues in your career or catastrophic breakdowns in your relationships or just societal decay in general, the impulse is always to hope for a sudden, miraculous intervention.
A stroke of luck. A bailout.
Yeah, but this text is demanding the exact opposite. It is demanding that we tune our intellect, gather the data, recognize the prevailing winds of our environment, and deduce the solution using the unbending laws of cause and effect.
And that heavy reliance on cause and effect brings us right to the moment the brothers and Jacob finally come face to face after the truth is out.
Oh man, the scene.
The traumatic secret that has poisoned this family for decades is just sitting right in the middle of the room.
The elephant in the room.
The biggest elephant. The brothers are forced to confront the father they deceived. They break down, and they ask Jacob to seek forgiveness for their sins.
Right. And Jacob responds that he will ask his Lord to forgive them, affirming the merciful nature of the divine law.
Right.
Now, on the surface, this reads like a very standard, emotionally satisfying resolution, doesn't it? We're sorry, we confess, please forgive us.
Oh, totally. It reads exactly that way until we dig into the specific Arabic terminology.
There we go.
Because the terminology essentially dismantles our modern, highly sanitized concept of an apology.
Oh, so?
Well, we tend to view forgiveness as an emotional eraser. You commit a wrong, you feel bad, you say, my bad, the other person accepts it, and boom, the slate is wiped clean.
Right, moving on.
But the source argues that this view is structurally incoherent with how the universe actually functions. It introduces this framework of what it calls social physics.
Social physics. Okay, let's look at the mechanism of the word used for sin here, which is zombie.
Yes, zombie.
Because the root of zombie literally translates to tail.
Which is such a powerful metaphor.
Think about the visceral reality of that. A crime against society or a profound personal betrayal is not an isolated event that just vanishes into the past. It generates a negative consequence that attaches to you.
Like a literal tail.
Yes, it trails behind you. It drags through the mud, disrupting your psychological peace and your social standing everywhere you go.
It is a lingering, destructive force. And honestly, in our current landscape, we see the physics of the zombie most clearly in the concept of the digital footprint. Or cancel culture.
Oh, that is the perfect modern parallel.
Right. A person makes a catastrophic moral error online, Or they commit a white-collar crime. They can issue all the tearful apologies they want on YouTube.
With the sigh and the bad lighting.
Exactly. They could feel genuine, profound remorse. But the tail of that action remains. It follows them to every single job interview.
It influences every future relationship.
Because the societal trust is broken, and a feeling of remorse does not rebuild the shattered architecture of that trust.
Okay, so if an apology isn't enough, how do you sever the tail?
Right. So the text outlines a two-step mechanical process. First step is tauba.
Okay, tauba. Now, tauba is usually cloaked in heavy religious overtones, right? It's almost always translated simply as repentance.
Right, very theological.
Yep.
But the source strips it down to its functional root. It literally means turning back, changing direction.
Okay, so if you are walking toward a cliff, tauba is the exact moment you realize your trajectory is fatal and you stop.
You turn around.
You cease the destructive action.
Yes. The brothers had stopped their act of betrayal. They had confessed, so they had performed tauba. They stopped the bleeding.
But, and this is the critical part, stopping the bleeding doesn't heal the wound.
Exactly.
And it certainly doesn't rebuild the bridge you just burned. You've turned around, sure, but the tail is still dragging behind you.
Yep. The consequences of throwing Yusuf in the decades of grief, the completely fractured family dynamic, those are still very real structural damages.
Which is why the brothers don't just stop at tauba.
Right. They asked Jacob to seek istighfar for them.
Istighfar.
And this is where the socioeconomic genius of the text really shines. Because istighfar comes from the root gafar.
And what does that mean?
It means a helmet, a shield, or armor.
Oh, wow.
It is not a passive plea for someone to just magically forget your mistake. It is the active, grueling pursuit of protection from the lingering natural consequences of your bad actions.
I really want the listener to think about this in their own life right now. Think about a time you sent an absolutely vitriolic, angry email to a colleague or maybe a partner.
We've all been there.
We have. And you realize, 5 minutes later, it was a huge mistake. You apologize. That's tauba. You stopped the attack.
Right, you didn't send a second email.
Exactly. But the promotion still goes to someone else. The relationship is still incredibly tense because the universe doesn't care about your internal apology. It cares about the physics of what you broke.
The trust is gone.
The trust is gone. So to survive the fallout of that email, to deal with the Zanbi, the tail, you have to build a helmet.
You have to introduce an overwhelming amount of positive, constructive actions into that environment to outweigh the negative impact.
You have to consistently show up early. You have to support that colleague publicly, rebuild the communication channels brick by literal brick.
You have to change the physics of the situation through active restorative labor.
Let's apply this to a macro level because the text is talking about society, not just individuals, like a corporate disaster.
Okay, yeah.
Imagine a massive energy company cuts corners on safety protocols and they spill millions of gallons of crude oil into a vital oceanic ecosystem.
A total catastrophe.
Right. So the executives hold a somber press conference. They express deep, heartfelt sorrow. They fire the negligent managers.
They have performed tauba.
Yes. They stopped the leak.
But the ocean is still toxic. Entire local economies based on fishing are completely decimated. Wildlife is dying. The tail of their corporate sin is actively destroying a whole region.
So a verbal apology in this scenario is structurally meaningless without istighfar.
Absolutely meaningless. The company must deploy billions of dollars, thousands of workers, and years of exhaustive labor to physically clean the water, rehabilitate the ecosystem, and financially restore the communities they ruined.
That massive, sustained infusion of constructive energy is the armor they must build.
Yes, to protect themselves from being entirely consumed by the consequences of their actions.
This completely reframes the entire reunion of Yusuf's family.
Oh, it changes everything.
Because this isn't just a touching family drama where everyone hugs and cries and lets bygones be bygones.
No, not at all.
Yusuf had already personally forgiven them. Back when they first realized he was the ruler of Egypt, he literally told them, "No reproach upon you today."
Right. On a purely interpersonal level, he let go of the grudge. He possessed that level of emotional mastery.
But Yusuf the brother, forgiving them, does not satisfy the universal law of cause and effect.
And it certainly does not satisfy the requirements of Yusuf, the head of state.
Wow, yes.
Because the brothers had committed a fundamental crime against the social order.
They conspired to murder.
They lied to their community. They destroyed the foundational trust of their mini-society. They needed istighfar from the divine law.
They had to actively demonstrate through sustained constructive behavior, that they could be integrated into the highly moral, equitable society Yusuf was currently running in Egypt.
They had to prove they were no longer a cancer to the system.
And that structural integration is what the next phase of the narrative is entirely about.
The border crossing.
Yes. The entire extended family finally crosses the border into Egyptian territory. Yusuf receives them with full state honors. He elevates his parents and makes a very specific, formal declaration.
Enter Egypt, if God wills, inshallah, in security.
Okay, we need to pull apart the phrase inshallah here.
Definitely.
Because modern cultural usage has completely hollowed this word out.
Oh, it's just a placeholder now.
Right. Today, it's used as a casual placeholder for hope or just uncertainty. I'll finish that report by Friday, inshallah.
We'll see you at dinner, inshallah.
Yeah, it basically just means hopefully if the stars align.
But the source aggressively contextualizes this phrase within the framework of statecraft.
Because when the sovereign ruler of a nation stands at the border and tells a group of migrants, enter Egypt, inshallah, in security, he is not expressing a wistful hope.
No, he is laying down constitutional law.
He is establishing a conditional reality.
The phrase translates functionally to, you will have absolute security in this land, strictly conditional upon your adherence to the divine laws implemented here.
So Yusuf is declaring the supremacy of the system over personal ties.
Exactly. He is telling his own family that true peace and security do not exist in a vacuum, and they certainly aren't guaranteed by nepotism.
Security is the natural byproduct of a society that submits to objective, equitable law.
He's effectively saying, I am your brother, and yes, I am the ruler, but I do not rule by my own arbitrary whims.
I rule by a constitutional system.
Yes, if you conform to that system, if God wills it, meaning if you align yourself with the divine blueprint of this society, you will be protected.
But if you try to act like the jealous, anarchic herdsman who threw a child in a well, the system will not protect you.
It is the ultimate triumph of the rule of law over the rule of man.
And this constitutional framing brings us to perhaps the most radical reinterpretation in the entire source document.
Oh, you're talking about the Sajda.
Yes, the act of the Sajda, the prostration.
This is huge.
Because the text describes the parents and the brothers falling down in prostration to Yusuf. And for centuries, religious art and traditional commentary have depicted this literally. They picture the elderly father, the mother, and the 11 brothers walking into a grand throne room and physically throwing their bodies to the marble floor, pressing their foreheads to the dirt at Yusuf's feet.
And our source attacks this literal interpretation with a sledgehammer.
A complete sledgehammer.
It argues that the physical subjugation of one human being to another is the ultimate degradation of human dignity.
Which makes sense, because the entire overarching narrative of these texts is about liberating humanity from the tyranny of pharaohs and kings who demand to be worshipped.
Exactly. Why would a prophet whose entire life's mission is to build a society based on absolute justice, human dignity, and the sovereignty of divine law force his elderly parents to humiliate themselves by kissing his feet?
It creates a massive philosophical contradiction.
It really does. If the goal is to abolish human tyranny, you don't celebrate a moment of absolute human subjugation just because the good guy is on the throne.
So if we strip away the religious myth of physical bowing, we have to define what sajda actually means in the context of statecraft and sociology.
Right. And the source reframes sajda as formal, active submission to an authority, a law, or a system.
So they weren't worshiping Yusuf the man.
No, they were ratifying the Nizam-e-Rububiyat.
Okay, we have to spend some time on this term, Nizam-e-Rububiyat, because it is the engine of the society Yusuf built.
It really is the core of everything.
So Nizam means a system, an order, or a constitution. And Rububiyat comes from a root that encompasses nourishment, sustenance, development, and bringing something to its full potential.
Right. So the Nizam-e-Rububiyat is a divine socio-economic system designed to ensure that every single individual within the society receives equitable access to resources, justice, and the opportunity to actualize their human potential.
Let's contrast that with modern systems to really clarify the mechanism here.
Good idea.
Because it's not modern capitalism, which often relies on the exploitation of labor and the hoarding of capital by a few, which, by the way, is exactly what caused the previous Egyptian systems to be vulnerable to the famine in the first place.
It's exactly. But it's also not a sterile authoritarian communism that strips away individual agency and forces equality through, terror.
Right. It is a social contract built on absolute objective justice, a welfare state where the welfare is viewed as a fundamental human right dictated by the laws of the universe.
Not a charity handed down by the rich.
Exactly. And Yusuf was the administrator, the head of this system. So when his family fell in Sajda, they were effectively signing the social contract.
Yes, they were a stateless group of nomadic herdsmen fleeing a famine, crossing the border into a highly organized sovereign state.
Their Sajda was their pledge of allegiance.
They were publicly declaring, "We submit to the constitutional laws of this land. We agree to abandon our tribal anarchic past. We agree to become productive, integrated members of this equitable society."
Think about the mechanics of a modern naturalization ceremony.
Oh, that's a perfect parallel.
When an immigrant becomes a citizen of a new republic, they stand in a courtroom, raise their right hand, and swear an oath to a constitution. They might be facing a human judge or looking at a piece of cloth with stars and stripes on it, but they are not worshiping the judge.
Yeah.
And they are not worshiping the fabric of the flag. They are submitting to the abstract rule of law that those symbols represent.
They are acknowledging the supremacy of the system that will guarantee their rights and demand their civic responsibilities.
I really want to challenge you, the listener, to apply this distinction to how we view power today.
It's so relevant right now.
How often do we, as a society, mistake the symbols of power for the actual system of order? We develop these massive cults of personality around politicians.
Oh, constantly. We obsess over the person sitting in the executive chair.
We project all our hopes and fears onto them as if they possess magical saving powers.
We mentally bow down to the human, completely forgetting that true stability, true security, lies entirely in the integrity and the equitable application of the systemic laws.
Yusuf did not want his family's worship. He wanted their socioeconomic integration.
And the moment this integration is formalized, Yusuf turns to his father and makes a profound connection.
Yeah, he says, "This is the realization of my childhood dream."
The dream from the very beginning.
He is referencing the vision that kicked off this entire brutal saga decades earlier. The dream where the young Yusuf saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing to him.
And remember, that dream was the catalyst for his brother's betrayal.
Because they interpreted it through the lens of tribal jealousy and human ego?
Right. They thought, this arrogant little boy thinks he's going to be a king and we are all going to be his slaves.
They viewed the dream as a direct threat to their personal autonomy and status. So they tried to murder him to prevent it from coming true.
But the realization of the dream in this throne room proves it was never an ego trip to begin with.
It wasn't about Yusuf's personal glory at all.
No, it was a prophetic metaphor regarding sociology.
The sun, the moon, and the stars represented his familial unit. And their bowing, their sajda, wasn't about them becoming his personal servants.
It was a prediction that they would eventually be forced, by the harsh realities of history and their own moral failures, to abandon their tribal chaos.
To integrate into the just, equitable system he was destined to build, the dream was about the triumph of a righteous social order over petty human jealousy.
Which brings us to Yusuf's final address, the climax of his entire narrative arc.
Yeah, he has achieved total victory here.
Total victory. He possesses absolute state power, unimaginable wealth, the complete vindication of his childhood visions, and the very men who tried to kill him are now legally subjugated to his authority.
This is the moment where almost every historical conqueror gives a speech detailing their own brilliance, right, and humiliating their enemies.
Always. But look closely at what Yusuf says,
Yeah.
and more importantly, look at what he chooses to omit.
It is a breathtaking display of emotional intelligence and statecraft, because he gives a summary of his journey, and he thanks the divine for taking him out of the prison.
Right.
But he deliberately, explicitly skips over the part where he was thrown in the well.
Why do you think that omission is so critical to the blueprint of this society?
Well, because the men standing right in front of him are the ones who threw him in that well.
Exactly.
If he brings it up right now, during this highly public, formal moment of their integration into the state, he destroys them.
He weaponizes their most heinous, shameful crime against them at the exact moment they are trying to pledge their loyalty.
He would be using his platform to inflict revenge.
And revenge is fundamentally incompatible with the Nizam Yerbubiyat.
So instead, he shifts the focus of his liberation entirely to his release from state imprisonment.
He focuses on a systemic injustice that was rectified, rather than dwelling on the personal, tribal betrayal of his brothers.
He understands that you cannot build a unified, functional society if the leadership is constantly weaponizing the past to humiliate its own citizens.
He provides them with a psychological off-ramp to retain their dignity while submitting to the law.
That is true leadership. And then he notes that the divine is subtle in fulfilling its designs.
The source zeroes in on this word, subtle.
Because we as humans are incredibly impatient, aren't we? When we see injustice, we want lightning bolts. We want immediate cinematic retribution.
But Yusuf is pointing out that the universe operates on slow, steady, inevitable physics.
The law of requital.
Yes, cause and effect doesn't always operate on our preferred timeline, but it is unbending.
The arc of the moral universe is long, and it bends through the subtle mechanics of economics, psychology, and social evolution.
Yusuf recognizes this underlying engine. He attributes all his success, his dominion over Egypt, his ability to interpret economic data and manage a global crisis, not to his own isolated genius, but to the Fatira Samawati Wallard,
The originator, the molder of the heavens and the earth.
This is a devastating critique of the modern ego.
It really is. Yusuf is at the pinnacle of human achievement, and he is deliberately stripping away his own mythos.
He isn't standing on the balcony like a modern tech billionaire or a self-proclaimed visionary claiming, "I am a self-made man. Look at my disruptive genius. I outsmarted the famine through my sheer force of will."
No, he is openly acknowledging the absolute supremacy of natural law over his personal intellect.
He is saying, I didn't invent the laws of agriculture. I didn't invent the laws of supply and demand or human psychology or social physics.
The originator of the universe established those unbending rules.
My only genius was having the humility to observe them, understand them, and align my entire society with them.
It totally shatters the cultural illusion of the self-made conqueror.
The source material is arguing that true mastery is not found in dominating nature or exploiting society or bending reality to your will.
True mastery is profound. Total submission to objective reality.
Yusuf didn't build his empire by fighting the physics of the world. He built it by surrendering to them completely. He identified the grain of the universe and he cut along it, rather than against it.
And that profound surrender leads directly to his final recorded words. It is his ultimate prayer.
Think about what a man in his position could ask for here.
He could pray for his dynasty to rule Egypt for 1,000 years. He could pray for endless wealth or immortality.
Instead, his final request is, cause me to die as a Muslim and join me with the righteous.
We must immediately strip away the later cultural and demographic connotations of the word Muslim to understand the mechanism of this prayer.
Absolutely. In the context of this specific textual analysis, it does not mean a member of a specific religious voting bloc.
No. The root of the word implies peace, absolute submission, and safety through alignment.
So to ask to die as a Muslim in this empirical framework means asking to remain someone whose every action, every decision, and every breath is in total conformity with the fundamental laws of the universe.
He is asking to be preserved from the ultimate track of power, corruption.
He knows that absolute power tends to inflate the human ego until it believes it is above the law.
He is praying that he never loses his alignment with the system he built. He wants his final act on earth to be one of humble integration.
He wants to be grouped with the righteous.
And the source defines the righteous not as people who just pray a lot, but as those who actively, practically maintain the balance, equity, and justice of the social order.
It really is the ultimate mic drop on human history.
He achieves everything a human being could possibly strive for in the material and political world. And his response is a desperate desire to remain a functioning, integrated gear in the machinery of the universe.
It is the absolute antithesis of the pharaohs who demanded to be worshipped as living gods. Yusuf demands to be remembered as a servant of the objective law.
So if we pull back and look at the massive journey we've unpacked today, the contrast between the traditional myth and this empirical blueprint is just staggering.
It really is.
We started with a story usually shrouded in literal magic, and we watched this text totally dismantle it. We saw how high-level pattern recognition and the political momentum of a caravan can be mistaken for a magical scent.
We saw the psychological mechanics of grief causing blindness and how the introduction of undeniable empirical evidence can shatter that cognitive darkness.
We took the concept of forgiveness and reframed it entirely. It's not a verbal eraser. We explored the terrifying reality of the zombie, the tale of our destructive actions.
And how we must actively build the armor of istighfar through massive constructive societal reconstruction to survive it.
We deconstructed the degrading myth of physical bowing, redefining the Sajda as the formal ratification of the Nizam-e-Rububiyat.
The signing of a social contract designed to nourish and develop every member of society equitably.
And finally, we saw a personal genius humbled. Yusuf rejecting the toxic myth of the self-made man, attributing his entire empire to his strict alignment with the natural laws established by the originator of the universe.
That brings us to the end of Yusuf's narrative arc. Verse 101 closes the book on his life.
Right.
But what is absolutely critical to understand about this text is that it does not just roll the credits and fade to black.
It doesn't treat this as a historical documentary that is now over.
No, it doesn't say, and Yusuf ruled justly, and they all lived happily ever after.
So what happens?
In the very next verses, the text executes a sudden, sharp pivot. The camera swings violently away from Egypt, away from antiquity, and it points directly through the page.
It points directly at the reader.
It points directly at you, the listener.
The text issues a final, uncompromising warning.
It essentially says, we have just laid out the exact mechanical blueprint of how a civilization is saved from collapse.
We showed you the devastating structural consequences of jealousy and betrayal.
We showed you the power of empirical evidence over emotion. We demonstrated the absolute necessity of equitable law and the triumph of the intellect.
We showed you the physics of reality.
And the question the text asks is, what are you going to do with this data?
Are you going to walk blindly past the evidence of history? Are you going to continue treating these narratives as comforting little fairy tales to tell your children at bedtime?
Or are you going to apply the law of requital to your own life, your own communities, and your own societies?
Because history is not a series of magical, random events dictated by an unpredictable sky god. It is a rigorous laboratory of cause and effect.
The text is demanding to know if you have developed the Farasat, the refined human intuition and intellect, to read the results of that laboratory and act accordingly.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought experiment for you to mull over as you go about your day. Look closely at the conflicts you are facing right now.
The real challenges.
Yeah. Look at the systemic decay in your workplace, the fractures in your personal relationships, or the massive socioeconomic challenges in your community. Are you sitting in the dark, paralyzed by grief or confusion, waiting for a magical shirt to fall from the sky and cure your blindness?
Or are you ready to engage your intellect, read the circumstantial evidence that is right in front of you, and start building your own blueprint?
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly expansive, challenging deep dive into the mechanics of history and human nature. We hope it shifted your perspective on how the world actually works as much as it did ours. Until next time, keep reading the evidence.